muscle structure and our muscle physiology. So we're going to break down all the different little parts of the muscles, kind of see what their roles are, and then we're going to see how we use all those and how they all play their role and enable us to kind of create these contractions and create a force to kind of move the body around. Okay? So your muscles are going to make up half of your body's mass. Obviously, that can change based on if you're more muscular versus less muscular. And the cool thing about your muscles is that they can take this chemical energy, or they can take ATP, and they can turn it into this mechanical energy, which just means that we're using this chemical or this ATP, and we're going to use it to produce force in the body. Okay, so you have three types of muscle tissue. We saw this when we looked at the under the microscopes, when we looked at the tissues. We have skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle. You just want to have a general idea of sort of how they're different, and we're going to look at that in the next couple slides here. You also want to realize that there's certain terms where if you see these in a word, it's always going to mean that it's pertaining to muscle. So if you ever see myo, you ever see ms, you ever see sarco, it means that it has something to do with a muscle. Okay, so we want to really get used to kind of all this terminology and see how the words kind of give us hints as to, what the definitions might be. So skeletal muscles are organs that attach to and cover the bony skeleton. These are the ones that most people are kind of familiar with, or the things we think about when we're talking about muscle. They're going to be composed of striations. So these are more like the characteristics and how they're going to differ from muscle type to muscle type. But skeletal muscle is going to have striations. They're going to be voluntary, which means that they're under our conscious control, or we can purposely kind of tell our body to move these muscles. They're responsible for body mobility. So again, this is walking and running and jumping, but it is also this manipulation of our environment. So don't forget about that one. And then these ones are going to contract rapidly, but they're going to also tire, or they're going to fatigue really, really easily. Okay, but they can create a tremendous amount of power. And again, these are the main characteristics at the bottom that you want to remember for our multiple choice test. Okay, they're going to skeletal muscle is going to be striated, and it's going to be the one that's going to be voluntary. Now we move on to cardiac muscle. Only going to be found in the heart, not found anywhere else in the body. So it constitutes most of the heart walls. And again, your heart is just a big muscle that's contracting to sort of pump this blood throughout the body. This one is also going to be striated, but it's involuntary. And again, by that, it means that we're not consciously in control of our heartbeat. It just kind of beats on its own. So cardiac muscle, striated. Okay, because that's a good multiple choice question, right? Which one of these is striated, which one of these is not striated, or which one is voluntary, which one is involuntary. And again, this one is going to be an involuntary one. Okay, smooth muscle, found in the walls of hollow visceral organs. So it's the organs in your body, so stomach, urinary bladder, respiratory passages. Again, with this one, we're contracting to force fluids and other substances through our internal body channels. No striations in this one, and again, this one's going to be involuntary. The contractions are going to be slow and sustained as we're pushing these things through the body, but again, we're not in control of these contractions. Your body's just going to do it on its own. So visceral organs, non-striated, and this one is going to be involuntary. So you get four characteristics of muscle, and then you're also going to get a few different functions. The four characteristics are basically just what makes muscle different from all these different kind of tissues in the body. So you have excitability, you have contractility, you have extensibility, and then you have elasticity. And we're going to look at sort of each one of these and how these characteristics kind of help your muscle to perform its function. So excitability just means that your muscle can receive and respond to stimulus, and this is going to be from your brain. So your brain's going to send these impulses to the muscle, telling them to contract, telling them to relax, telling them sort of what to do. Okay, contractility is this ability to shorten forcefully when stimulated. Again, this is just, we know our muscles can contract. They're not always shortening when they contract. We're going to come back to that a little bit. There's different kind of types of contractions. And what you want to do is kind of get away from this shortening and just realize that when they're contracting, they're just producing tension. Okay, and we'll talk about that a little bit too. They have this extensibility, which is their ability to extend or stretch, okay, so they can be lengthened. And then they have this elasticity, which means that once they're done contracting or once they're done being stretched out, they can return to their resting length. So they're not stuck in these shortened or these lengthened position. They're going to always sort of, once that impulse is done and the muscle is done being active, they're going to return to their normal length. Okay, so now we get into the functions. So there's characteristics, and then there's functions. So the important functions of the muscles, again, we've talked about these a bunch already. We're going to produce movement. We're going to help our body to maintain our posture, body position. We're going to stabilize joints. And we're also going to use our muscles to produce heat. So again, good. Anything that's about the function of skeletal system, function of the muscles. Always good questions for those multiple choice, okay? So producing movement, we've talked about this a bunch, but it's locomotion, manipulating my environment. It's going to move substances kind of through the body. That's one that most people kind of forget about a little bit. It's going to help to maintain posture and body position. So your muscles are always active, even just to reduce, resist the forces of gravity. Okay, so just standing up or sitting up straight, you're going to use your muscles to kind of maintain those positions. And really, if you just turned all your muscles off all at one time, this is kind of what would happen to you, right? We would just kind of collapse and kind of fall over if we had no muscle activity. So even when you're just sitting, because I get this a lot where people are like, oh, I just was sitting all day, my neck is sore, my back is sore. You have to realize that even in those really basic positions where we think we're not really doing anything, those muscles are still active to kind of keep you in that seated or that standing up position. Okay, our muscles are going to stabilize our joints. We mentioned this a little bit, especially with the shoulder. So we said our muscles can strengthen, stabilize joints, but again, it's only when they're active. And again, if they fatigue or they get injured, we lose a lot of the stability to the joints, which becomes a big problem. And then we also talked about this one. So this one we said they're going to generate heat. They're going to help us to maintain our body temperature. And again, they're going to produce a lot of heat. I get a lot of questions like for me with running, when people say like, do you run all winter outside? And I do most of the times. I'm always going to run outside if I have that opportunity. And it's amazing, how much heat your body produces when you're moving. Okay, so they can really, really be helpful. And again, when we get cold, you'll start to shiver, you'll start to move around, you'll start getting that blood flow to all those different little parts of the body. And even in the really, really cold part of winter, really all you need when you're outside, as long as you keep moving, is just something to kind of break the wind, okay? So you keep the wind off your body and you keep moving, you'll produce as much heat as you need to kind of keep your body warm. Okay, so skeletal muscles are going to be made up of different things. So we're going to have nerves, we're going to have blood vessels, we're going to have connective tissues, and most of your muscles are going to be made up of these muscle fibers. So they're going to be the predominant thing that makes them up. But again, all these other things are going to be included in there too. So nerve and blood supply characteristics. Usually you're going to have one artery and one or more veins per muscle. Your arteries are going to branch out as they kind of enter the muscle to get those nutrients to all those different parts of the muscle. It's going to be supplied with a nerve ending. Again, we're using these nerves, from our brain and from our spinal cord to kind of control the activity of the muscle. We need a rich supply of blood because your muscles are very, very active. Okay, so they're going to use huge amounts of energy and they're going to require almost continuous delivery of oxygen and nutrients. So we need a lot of this ATP. We need a lot of that oxygen to sort of create this energy that we need to kind of keep contracting and keep being active with our muscles, right? They're also going to give off large amounts of metabolic waste. And then again, this is something that we have to sort of remove to be able to continually have these efficient contractions. Okay, so anytime you're producing a lot of energy, you're going to produce a lot of waste, and a lot of being in really good shape and kind of keeping your muscles active is this ability to how good is your body at eliminating all this waste that's going to be produced. But we'll come back to that when we move into the energy system part of the chapter. So we have all these connective tissue sheaths, okay, and these again are good for labeling because they're going to be on your practical, and they're good for just knowing sort of, what are the sequence of or the units that make up these muscles. So we have several different connective tissue sheaths, and they're going to help to reinforce and hold the muscle together. And again, I want to know them from the smallest to the largest, and this is your little sequence here, okay? So I have a bunch of myofibrils. We're going to see them in a picture here in a second. Those are going to make up a fiber. A bunch of fibers are going to make up a fascicle, and then a bunch of fascicles are going to make up the actual muscle. And then each of these is going to be wrapped in one of these tissue sheaths. And I just want to have an understanding of, what's the wrapping that wraps a fiber, wraps a fascicle, and then what's the proper name? Because again, those are good multiple choice questions too. And then here's what we're talking about. So I can see this big, huge muscle here, and then I'm getting these little breakdowns of all the parts that kind of make up that muscle. And I can see in this one that I have these wrappings around each of the different little parts. Okay, so this is a good picture again to kind of label and then kind of have beside you when you're going through the definitions. Okay, so these are my sheaths from internal to external. You can do it in whichever way is easier for you. Okay, but an endomysium is going to be the part that wraps a fiber. Okay, paramecium is going to surround a fascicle, and then this epimecium is going to be the one that surrounds this whole muscle. Okay, so you want to know endomysium, paramecium, epimecium, know what it wraps up, and then be able to sort of label it on the diagram. And again, you want to again, just like we did with the molecule, the cell, and how those building blocks. You want to be able to do the same thing with the muscle. So all these connective tissue sheaths are going to be continuous with each other, and with the tendon that joins the muscle to the bone. Again, a tendon is going to link that muscle to the bone. And then when your muscles contract, they're going to all pull on these sheaths, and then they're going to transmit that force to that attachment to the bone. Okay, so when you come back and you look at this picture, you want to realize that all these sheaths are combining to form this tendon, and then when this muscle fires, this is why your tendons are so strong, okay? And especially if you ever go in and see the cadavers and you get to kind of take a look at these tendons, they're so thick and they're so strong, but it's because you have all these little wrappings and all these sheaths that are coming up to form that one little tendon. So it makes an amazingly strong structure, okay? So they're going to provide, again, they're going to allow me to transmit this force to the bone and create this movement, but they're also going to provide a little bit of elasticity. Okay, so here's our little picture again, and again, I want to know a bunch of myofibrils make up a fiber, a bunch of fibers make up a fascicle, and then a bunch of fascicles are going to make up the muscle. And then I just want to know, what's the wrapping of each of these parts, and then eventually we're going to add one more thing that's going to make up our myofibrils. Okay, so again, here's just the sequence. It's a good one to kind of remember, just to put it in order. And again, it's nice to have these pictures beside you as you're going through this chapter, because then you can go back and just take a quick look at each of the structures when that term pops up. So we have different attachments. Again, we talked about this tendon is going to insert on the bone, but we have a couple different ways that we can attach muscles to the bone, okay? And most skeletal muscles are going to cross at least one joint, and they're going to attach in two places. We've already mentioned like the origin and the insertion, but just to go over it again, the origin is usually more proximal, okay? And it's going to be the part that's less movable or more stable. And then the insertion is usually going to be more distal or further down, and it's going to be the part that's more movable. So it's going to be the part that kind of moves. The origin is the part that is stable and kind of stays still as we're contracting these muscles. So here is a picture of our bicep. And again, I know I'm looking at the front part of my bicep because I can see my clavicle, right? I can see there's no spine on the scapula. And again, I have this origin of my bicep. I have my two heads, and then I have my insertion. And then again, when you're talking origin, insertion, and this one's higher up, so it's more proximal. This one is lower down, so it's more distal. And again, when I contract my bicep to bend my elbow, my shoulder is going to stay still, and then it's this lower part that's going to move, okay? So stable part, movable part. And then you can do the same thing. Here's a picture of my scapula again, but now I'm looking at it from the backside, and I have my rhomboid muscles here, and you can see that I have their origin is along my spine, and their insertion is going to be along that medial part of the scapula. And when I contract this muscle and I make it shorter, it's going to pull this scapula towards my spine. Okay, so the spine part's going to stay nice and stable, so it's the origin. The insertion part's going to move, so the insertion of these muscles is going to be that medial border of that scapula, okay? And you can kind of do this with any muscle, and kind of you can think about it as you move around. This is where, when you're sitting down and you're studying, you want to kind of bend your elbows, shrug your shoulders, do all those things, and kind of see which part moves and which part stays stable. Okay, so we get different types of attachments. You're going to have direct and indirect. Direct just means that epimysium is going to actually be fused to that outer part of the bone, or that periosteum. Okay, this one, not as common. The most common one is going to be this indirect attachment, and this is where, for labeling, or not so much for labeling, but for multiple choice stuff, you want to just realize that this is an example of my tendons. Okay, so my tendons are going to be termed indirect attachments, and again, they're going to anchor that muscle to the connective tissue covering of the bone. Okay. So indirect attachments, again, most common. They can withstand the abrasion of bony surfaces, and that's really the main job of your tendons, right? That soft tissue or that muscle, if it had to sort of rub on that bone and sort of go across the bone all the time, eventually it would tear. And then, also I can get, it was as we looked at with the ankles and we looked at with the wrists, I can get a lot of tendons into a really small space, right? But I cannot get a lot of these big muscles into the space. So a lot of times you'll see where, especially with the wrists and the ankles, the muscles that control those joints are going to be higher up, and then the tendons are going to be the part that's going to attach around the joint and allow me to create this kind of movement. Okay? Alright, so now we get to a little bit of the trickier part, where we get the structure of our skeletal muscle fibers. So again, each skeletal muscle fiber is a long cylindrical cell. So each fiber, you want to think of it as a cell, and it's going to have all the things that we talked about in our cell chapter. Okay, it's going to be surrounded by a sarcolemma. Okay, and we're going to take a picture and kind of break it down a little bit more here in a second. But the sarcolemma is going to just be the plasma membrane, but it's of a skeletal fiber. Okay, so it gets, remember we said sarco is always pertaining to a muscle. So sarcolemma, you want to think it's just the plasma membrane of a muscle cell. Okay, sarcoplasm is going to be the cytoplasm of the muscle cell, and it's going to contain a lot of these glycosomes. It's going to contain a lot of myoglobin, and again, these come down to just the fact that it needs a lot of energy. So these glycosomes are going to be stored glycogen that I can break down and I can turn into ATP, and then my myoglobin is going to store oxygen for me, again, in just ways that I'm going to use them to create energy to keep this muscle functioning. Okay, so just make sure you know sarcolemma, plasma membrane, sarcoplasm, same as the cytoplasm of the cell that we looked at earlier. So here's our little picture of this muscle fiber, kind of wrapped up in that sarcolemma, and then I can see this sarcoplasm, and then again, everything's going to kind of float around and be, within this sarcoplasm. Okay, so now we get to structures in muscle cells. So muscle cells are going to contain three structures. They're going to play important roles in the muscle contraction. Again, we want to know sort of just what the basic function of all these things are going to be. So I'm going to have myofibrils, I'm going to have a sarcoplasmic reticulum, and then I'm going to have these T-tubules. And then now we're going to kind of break down what each one of these is kind of made of here. Okay, so here is a picture of my sarcolemma again. And again, I can see these myofibrils here. Okay, and then this blue part is going to be the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and this T-tubule is going to be this white part here, and it's going to actually be branching off of this sarcolemma. Okay, so this one just gives me a picture of those three things that we just kind of talked about, and then we're going to go through each one of them, and then we'll come back and we'll kind of look at how they function kind of all together. But again, keep these pictures beside you as you're going through the chapter. And then again, you want to break it down to what's the basic function of each one of these structures. So myofibrils, they're going to be a single muscle fiber contains hundreds to thousands of these rod-like myofibrils. Okay, they're going to run parallel to the muscle length. They're going to account for 80% of the cellular volume. They're going to contain, again, striations, sarcomeres, and they're going to contain these myofilaments here, okay? So these structures are going to make up the contractile elements of skeletal muscle. And again, that just means that this is what allows our muscles to form these contractions and sort of produce this force. Okay, so what do we mean by striations? And again, we've seen pictures in the tissue chapter of what these muscles look like, but striations are these repeated dark and light bands that are evident along each length of the myofibril. We're going to see a picture here in a second, and you're going to have these A bands, which are going to give the dark appearance, and you're going to have these I bands, which are going to give the light appearance, okay? And then these bands give the cells their striated appearance if you looked at them under a microscope. So this is what they would kind of look like, and I can see I have dark bands and light bands, and it gives it, again, this striated appearance in their muscle fibers. And here's just a drawing where, again, this is a drawing of a myofibril, and again, this one, for the next part of the chapter, you want to have this picture beside you, because then I can go back and I can find the lines and I can find all the different parts of the myofibrils as we're sort of breaking them down and looking at what the functions are going to be. But you can see I have these red parts and I have these lighter parts, and when I link all these together, that's what gives me the appearance of those striations, okay? So a sarcomere is going to be a region of a myofibril. It's going to be located between the two successive Z discs. So again, you want to have that picture beside you. It's going to be the smallest contractile unit of a muscle fiber. Always a good multiple choice question. And then it's also going to be known as the functional unit of a skeletal muscle. Okay, it contains an A band, a full A band, and it's flanked by half of an I band on each end. So that sounds really tricky unless you have that picture beside you. And we're going to go back to the picture here in a second. And we just want to, this is where you want to kind of have it and just be able to look at it as we go through and explain things, because it'll keep you from having to kind of memorize. And then again, we're going to link a lot of these sarcomeres kind of end to end to make these fibers. So here is our picture again, and in this part we just want to find the sarcomere. So we said I have this full A band. So the A band is from right here all the way over to here, so it's the red fibers, okay, full A band, and then I have my Z line or my Z disc. Okay, so I have one on each side, and then they talked about, okay, I have half of an I band, okay, so the I band is this little lighter part here, and you can see my Z disc is here, and my sarcomere is from Z disc to Z disc, and you can tell I have a full A band, and then I have half of this little I band, okay, and that's going to make up that sarcomere, okay? But very important to have that picture and just be able to sort of go back real quick and kind of take a look at it just to make sure as they're explaining things and you get the definitions that you're understanding what they're kind of telling you. Okay, so here's another picture. Again, I want to remember that I have that myofibril and I can see the striations, right? And you can see that I have a bunch of these sarcomeres linked up or aligned together. And again, it's going to be wrapped by this whole little sarcolemma, which again is just the plasma membrane. Okay. All right. So now we got to take a closer look at these myofilaments. So myofilaments, again, are going to make up my myofibril. So we had a myofibril. Now we're going to look at what makes up a myofibril, and it's going to be these myofilaments. And the myofilaments are going to be actin, and they're going to be your thin filaments. And we're going to have myosin, which is going to be your thick filaments. Okay, so now we've added one more. So we had a myofibril, a bunch of them make up a fiber, a bunch of fibers make up a fascicle, a bunch of fascicles make up a muscle. Now we have our myofilaments, and a bunch of these are going to make up that myofibril. Okay, so we've just added one more smaller kind of element to the mix here. Okay, so what are these filaments? So thick filaments are going to be central. They're going to contain myosin. Very, very good, again, multiple choice question. They're going to extend the entire length of the A band. We saw that in just a second ago. And they're going to be connected in the middle by this M line. And again, we'll come back to the picture and we'll kind of make sure we can just identify all these different little things. Your thin filaments are going to be more lateral. They're going to contain actin. Okay, so it's going to be blue. The myosin is going to be red. They're going to extend across the I band and partway into the A band. And we're going to have these Z discs, which we just saw, and they're going to anchor the thin filaments kind of laterally. So again, as you're reading over this stuff, it always makes it seem a little confusing. But when you go back to the picture, you can kind of work everything through. Okay, so here are my Z discs or Z lines. And again, these blue things coming off of the Z discs are my actin filaments. And then I have my A band, and again, these are my myosin filaments. Okay, and I can see in the middle here, I have this M line. And this is what's going to be connecting these myosin filaments. Okay, so don't make it any more complicated than it kind of needs to be. You just want to find all those different little things, and then I can see that these actin filaments, I have some that go this way and they come into this M line or this A band, and I have some that go the other way and they go into the A band in the opposite direction. Okay, and this is how I'm connecting all of these sarcomeres together when I get these contractions. Okay, and here's another picture of where I just get a little zoomed in version. Okay, so I get my Z lines. I could see my actin coming off of my Z lines. I could see my M line here, and I could see my A band with all my myosin. And eventually what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect these two together, and then I'm going to shorten everything, and I'm going to kind of pull everything a little more centrally. So here is again just a picture of the same thing, but you want to remember that I'm aligning all of these sarcomeres one after the other to create this really long muscle fiber. Okay. All right, and then here's a picture of just everything together. So it's one of those, if you like to have sort of everything on one page, this is a good one where you get kind of that big picture and then you get that zoomed in picture at the same time with all the little definitions on there. So now we look at the molecular composition of these myofilaments. So we want to really break down these myofilaments and sort of know how this actin and this myosin are a little bit different. So my thick myosin filaments, okay, and this is the important part, is that they're going to have these globular heads, okay? So they have a rod-like tail with a flexible hinge, and then the tail has these two heads on there, okay? And the heads are going to link the thick and thin filaments during a muscular contraction. And a lot of us from high school, we've heard about this forming of these cross bridges. This is what they're talking about when you're talking about forming these cross bridges, is I'm linking these thick myosin filaments with these thin actin filaments, okay? But very, very important to remember that the thick myosin filaments are the ones that have the heads. Okay, so here's a picture of my myosin, and I can see I have these globular heads on there. Okay, my thin actin filaments, okay, and these are going to be the ones that they're going to actually have the binding sites, okay? So they have active sites to which myosin heads can attach during contraction. You're going to have two intertwined actin filaments, and again, they're going to form the backbone of each of these thin filaments. So again, myosin, globular heads, actin, thin, and again, these ones have the binding sites. Okay, always a good question that kind of comes up. Which one has the head? Which one has the binding sites? But again, I'm going to link these together when I'm performing a contraction, and then that linking is again that cross bridge formation. So thin filaments contain several regulatory proteins because again, I don't want my muscles to be contracting all the time. They're going to have tropomyosin. We saw that in the picture a second ago. But it's going to spiral around the actin core and help stiffen and stabilize. But the main thing that this tropomyosin is going to do is it's going to block these myosin binding sites when the muscle is relaxed. Okay, so very, very important. Tropomyosin blocks the myosin binding sites. Now troponin is going to be a binding protein, okay, and it's going to bind actin, position this tropomyosin, and sort of bind calcium. But again, these two things are going to help me sort of keep these sites blocked until I want these muscles to kind of contract, okay. So both tropomyosin and troponin help to control the myosin-actin interactions involved in muscular contraction, and it's all going to come down to this nerve stimulation. So when I get this nerve stimulation, I'm going to unblock these sites, and I'm going to be able to sort of form these cross bridges, okay. So thin actin filaments, binding sites, and I can see that my tropomyosin is sort of blocking those binding sites, and my troponin is the part that I'm going to do a binding. I'm going to bind something to troponin, and it's going to cause this shift, and I'm going to unblock these binding sites. Okay, so here's another picture of just everything kind of linked together. And again, we just want to know what the basic function of each of these parts is and sort of know how they differ. So now we get to the next part, which is the sarcoplasmic reticulum and the T-tubules. So your skeletal muscle fibers are going to contain two sets of intracellular tubules that are going to help regulate muscular contraction. Okay, so I'm going to have this sarcoplasmic reticulum we saw a picture a minute ago, and we're going to have these T-tubules. And again, I just want to know what their role is and their basic function is in creating a muscular contraction. Okay, so we come back to this picture, and we just want to find the things that we're trying to kind of identify. So the blue part is the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and then this white line here is going to be that T-tubule. Okay, so what do each of these do? So my sarcoplasmic reticulum is a sleeve-like system of interconnected tubules. They're going to surround each myofibril. I'm going to have a T-cistern of the sarcoplasmic reticulum. It's going to run perpendicular at the A and I bands. Again, we want to go back to the picture and just find that T-cistern. And the main job of the sarcoplasmic reticulum, the most important part, is that you want to realize that it's going to store calcium for me, and it's going to release it on demand when my muscles are stimulated to contract. Okay, so the job of that sarcoplasmic reticulum is going to hold on. When it gets stimulated, it's going to release that calcium, and it's going to allow the contraction to sort of continue. Okay, and then we'll come back in the next part and we'll look at exactly sort of how do we release this calcium. Okay, my T-tubule is an elongated tube. It's formed at each A-band and I-band junction. Okay, and then the sarcolemma of the muscle cell protrudes deep into the cell interior to form this T-tubule. Okay, so each T-tubule is going to run between the paired terminal cisterns of the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Again, we'll come back to the picture here in a second, and we're going to form this triad, and we're going to have a T-cistern on one side, the T-tubule in the middle, and then this T-cistern on the other side, and it's going to wrap this whole sarcomere. Okay, so what does a T-tubule do for me? During muscular contraction, our T-tubules are going to conduct impulses to the deepest regions of the muscle cell. So remember, the T-tubules are coming from that sarcolemma, and when I stimulate this muscle fiber, I have to get that impulse down into the muscle, and this is how I get that impulse down into the muscle, is through this T-tubule, okay? And then the T-tubule is going to stimulate that sarcoplasmic reticulum to release its calcium, okay? And then this is going to come into play where I unblock my binding sites, I'm going to be able to form my cross bridges, and we're going to be able to create these muscular contractions, okay? So in this picture, you want to just kind of find everything again. So I have my sarcoplasmic reticulum. These little lines here of the sarcoplasmic reticulum are the terminal cisterns, okay? And then this white part here is my T-tubule. So these three things form that triad. And again, you want to just remember that this T-tubule is actually coming from that sarcolemma. And when we get to the part about the nerve stimulation, you just want to realize that this sarcolemma is going to be the part that's going to get stimulated, and then it can get that stimulation into the muscle by going through this little T-tubule here, okay? And then what's going to happen? That's going to tell my sarcoplasmic reticulum to release its calcium, okay? And then we can form our little cross bridges. So here is just a zoomed in picture of the sarcoplasmic reticulum, okay? So here is my sarcolemma. Here is my T-tubule, and again, this is where that nerve impulse is coming into the muscle. And then what happens is when that nerve impulse comes into the muscle, it's going to stimulate the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Again, that's the part that's filled up with calcium. It's going to release its calcium, and then that's going to be the next part of our chapter that we're going to kind of look at, is that it's going to unblock all those binding sites and allow me to form these cross bridges between my actin and my myosin. Okay, so at this part we're just trying to look at how are our muscles constructed, and then the next part we're going to come back and look at, you know, what are the steps for creating this muscular contraction. Okay, so that's the first part of our physiology chapter, and then again we're going to probably break this one down into one or two more little videos.